Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Sepehrrad, and on behalf of Organization of Iranian American Communities, I'd like to welcome all of you to the last webinar of OIAC for 2020. Today, we will be discussing the issue of US-Iran policy, and more importantly, a comprehensive policy that focuses on the issue of human rights, terrorism, and regional threat by the regime in Tehran. Over the last several weeks, we have witnessed a range of debates on Iran policy and what to expect as we prepare in 2021. And needless to say, these debates continue to be exploited by the pressure groups advocating on behalf of the Iranian regime. And that's why it makes our discussion timely and crucial to address what is the message of the people of Iran and not the regime in Tehran. Our program today would start with a policy discussion with my colleagues from OIAC Advisory Board members, and I have the privilege of moderating that session. And after that, Mr. Amir Ahmadi will moderate a panel of OIAC's young professionals and students. And our last panel will be a roundtable dialogue with some of our community leaders, moderated by Sadeghpour. I want to welcome all of the panelists for being part of our program today and excited to hear your thoughts today. So let's get started with our first panel. And everyone, please adjust your videos. And I'd like to ask our first panelists to please unmute yourselves. Joined with Professor Kazerounian, Dean of School of Engineering at University of Connecticut, Dr. Ali Parsa, Professor of History, Humanities, and Religion from California State University, Fullerton, Los Angeles, and Dr. Majid Sadeghpour, healthcare practitioner and political director of OIAC. Welcome to you all, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
So Professor Kazerounian, I'd like to start with you as the most senior member of our board. To start with, in your view, what are the key elements of a comprehensive US-Iran policy?
Thank you, Ramesh. Thank you for having me. It is great to be here today. And let me just take a minute to recognize the important work that OIAC has been doing since its inception. Our mission is to advocate a democratic, secular, and non-nuclear government in Iran. What we want is an Iran that is founded on respect for human rights, gender equality, religious and ethnic tolerance, social and economic justice, and peaceful existence with the world. An Iranian American, as an Iranian American, I should say, this is what we are advocating. We believe democracy for Iran aligns with security for America. It is with that lens that we look at the US policy on Iran. Now getting back to your question, I think there are three key drivers that will formulate a comprehensive policy on Iran. Point one, we think that we have to be vigilant about the escalated human rights violations in Iran, the high-profile executions and arrests like Navid Afkari and others are not by accident. It carries a message that this regime is hell-bent on oppression in order to survive. Now the question is, how will the US policy respond to such violent and inhumane posture by the regime? Mm-hmm. More than 1,500 protesters were massacred last year in the November of 2019 uprising. More than 30,000 political prisoners were massacred in 1988, something that Amnesty International calls ongoing crimes against humanity because of how the regime tried and continued to conceal the truth about these mass killings. 7 United Nations human rights experts have written a letter to the regime describing the 1988 massacre of thousands of political prisoners as crime against humanity. And we are not talking about the crimes of one Rouge faction. We are talking about the regime in its entirety, including the supreme leader, Rouhani's entire cabinet, IRGC, and the besieged forces. All these people have a direct role in ongoing killings and arrests of the Iranian protesters and opponents. We must promote and encourage a path to justice and accountability on these crimes. And as such, a comprehensive US policy on Iran must include the specific measures to address these issues. Point two, we have to actively monitor the elevated terrorist activities by the Iranian regime, especially its recent plots against opponents in Europe and in the US. Terror diplomacy is mullah's modus operandi. If you look at the last 40 years, terror plots and a culture of terrorism is something that this regime has fostered, funded, and has never really directly paid for it until the arrest of its diplomat, Asadullah Assadi, in Germany. By all accounts, with all the evidence on the table, it is the entire regime's leadership that is put on trial in Belgium now. The key question is, will the US policy on Iran disable Tehran's terror and hostage taking? If we ignore these realities, the United States will have a dangerous foreign policy challenge beyond the nuclear deal, JCPOA, with mullahs in 2021.
These are very excellent points, Dr. Kazerounian, but let me follow up on that. Why would Iran respond to a US policy that is based on these key drivers that you just talked about?
That's a great question. I think that in the heart of the problem, the Iranian regime has no legitimacy. We must separate the regime from the people of Iran. If you look at the situation inside Iran, it is ripe for major change in favor of the Iranian people and not the regime. I would say, take a look at the ongoing execution in Iran. Look at the treatment of the political prisoners. Look at the situation of women, religious and ethnic minorities, labor movement, union workers, climate justice activists, and the retired workers. The element of resistance and defiance against this regime is growing day by day. And even the regime's officials are talking about a downfall. Let me actually I read a quote for you from one of the regime's people, Sadeghpour, who is an analyst very close to the Rouhani's faction, who recently warned that, quote unquote, I am fearful that in the next round, there is no way to contain these people. If this happens, this fire will burn all of us together. And this is not a unique quote. This is the tone that we hear from regime's officials left and right these days. My point is that there is a new reality on the ground, and we must recognize the Iranian people's demand for freedom at the center of any policy on Iran. Remember that there has been waves of nationwide uprisings since 2017, and the most popular slogans in these protests are down with Rouhani, down with Khamenei, and mullahs must get lost. Fear is now shifted from the public to the regime, who has acknowledged that their own loss of legitimacy, even by force.
Professor Parsa, I'd like to turn to you on the issue of terrorism as well. Do you agree with Professor Kazerounian, and do you think a more comprehensive US policy can in fact deter the regime's terrorist agenda?
First of all, thank you, Ramesh, and good morning or good afternoon to the panelists and the audience. Absolutely, I agree. We have to take a step back and look at the regime's record in the last 4 years. Since 1984, the mullah's regime continued to enlist as the most active state-sponsored global terrorism by the US State Department. this is not a regime that just terrorizes its own people. They kill opponents abroad, especially in Europe, and since day one, they use terrorism and hostage taking, if you remember, as a means to communicate with the rest of the world. This regime has survived on these very pillars that Professor Kazerounian rightly talked about. One, suppression at home, two, terrorism abroad, and the third, regional meddling through proxy wars to retain and expand its influence. The culture of terror is, in the name of Islam, was indoctrinated by Khomeini's vision, and Khamenei and Rouhani are still operating on that vision. As this regime uses religion as a weapon, and now others like ISIS follow this model in the region. Let us be clear. What they do has nothing to do with Islam, with a real Islam, a topic that I deeply care and deeply take care about and lecture on. But coming back to our discussion, if you look at this regime's victim of human rights violation and terrorist activities in the region, the majority of the victims are Muslims. I raise this because we really have to be clear on the nature of this barbaric regime. Many of us refer to this regime as religious fascism that uses terrorism at home and abroad to stay in power. If we have a comprehensive US policy on Iran, which calls the regime for what it is, it resonates with the Iranian people who are challenging this regime on every front, and they are a key factor in the US policy on Iran.
At the turn of the year, Iran erupted in protests. Calls for regime change rocked Iran. For years, Iranian society has been like a powder keg waiting to explode. Iran's 80 million population is yearning for change. While the vast majority of the population lives in poverty, the mullahs spend the nation's wealth on supporting the Assad regime in Syria and spreading terror in Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere. The protests began over rising costs and economic corruption, but they quickly turned political. In a matter of days, the protests spread to 142 cities. The extensive nature of the protests and the pace of events rattled the mullah's dictatorship, resorted to brutal measures to crack down on protesters. They also brought down the internet to prevent communication.
Very good point, Professor Parsa. Thank you for that. Let me turn to Dr. Sadeghpour and bring him into this conversation. Do you think a comprehensive US policy can in fact curb Iran's influence in the region and its drive for regional hegemony?
Thank you, Ramesh. It's great to be with my colleagues on this virtual event. I would agree with the points my colleagues have raised. I would like to take it a little further on the issue of terrorism and add to Professor Parsa's points, valid points, I must add. As we sit here today, an Iranian diplomat is evading sentencing in Europe because of his direct role in the terror plot against Iranian opposition's Free Iran gathering in 2018. And I'm talking about Asadullah Assadi, who was arrested in Germany, stripped of his immunity, and later extradited to Belgium on charges of planning to commit mass murder in Europe. This is the first time, in fact, that an Iranian diplomat is caught and is facing justice for a crime with compelling evidence, which demonstrate how far this regime is willing to go when it comes to killing its opponents and dissidents by committing acts of terrorism in Europe. To give it some context, it's important to remember that throughout the 1980s and 90s and even beyond, the regime in Iran and its diplomats committed a number of terrorist operations in Europe and planned or directly carried out terrorist assassinations and operations against Iranian dissidents in Europe, not to mention planning terrorist operations in Iraq and against US personnel even in Iraq against Iranian dissidents in Camp Ashraf. In fact, Asadullah Assadi himself was an Iranian agent working out of the Iranian embassy in Baghdad from 2013 to 2018. That's a sobering fact. On the issue of regimes' abuses of diplomatic privileges and terrorism, however, it's important to note that the United States Congress has set the tone already, so that the international community has a platform, if you may, to follow, and the US policy is guided by this. A few recent actions come to my mind as we think about this. First, earlier this year in 2020, nearly 400 bipartisan members of Congress, in a letter to the administration, demanded continued sanctions and arms embargo against the regime in Tehran. Following the 2019, November 2019 protests in Iran, the House unanimously passed House Resolution 752. And in that, the resolution says, and I quote, "We stand with the people of Iran that are engaged in legitimate and peaceful protests against an oppressive, corrupt regime." And of course, I must, as an Iranian American, highlight House Resolution 374 and the 220 majority in the House by partisan members of Congress, which not only condemned regime's terrorism and demanded accountability, but also expressed support for a secular, democratic, non-nuclear republic in Iran, and highlighted Madam Rajavi's 10-point plan for a future Iran. These are long-standing wishes of the Iranian people, which is etched in the country's 100-year, a century-long struggle for democracy, and is summarized in the chants in the streets of Iran that my colleagues alluded to earlier. Essentially, no monarchy and no theocracy. I think it's an important message to consider as the United States takes aim at policy decisions going forward. I think it's a topic that perhaps requires a lot more discussion, but I want to go back to your question directly on the issue of regional hegemony real quickly. If you go back to the pre-Iran-Iraq war, when the regime's founder Khomeini promoted the agenda of liberation of Jerusalem via Karbala, we see how deeply gaining the control in the entire Middle East has always been, and still remains today, an objective and a strategy for this regime. 40 years later, however, the Middle East that we see today is a very different place than what Khomeini and his gang envisioned. In succeeding developments over the past decade, the political shifts and alliances that had been formed in the Middle East are no longer in place and no longer in favor of the Ayatollahs in Iran. That's why Professor Kazerounian is correct in saying that urgent attention is needed, and recognizing the new realities can help guide comprehensive US policy towards Iran. Let's recall what is happening in Iran and in Lebanon a year ago in November and December. Protests against the Iranian regime raged across Iran, Iraq, and in cities like Baghdad and Karbala, where people torched Iranian regime consulates and in widespread nationwide protests against Iranian influence. Okay. The fact is that this regime is now being challenged by the people in the region, including in Iraq and in Lebanon. During the 2019 protests in October and November, December in the streets of Gaza and Baghdad, people chanted slogans rejecting Iranian influence and their proxies in the region. I remember Qasem Soleimani traveled to Iraq during those protests, and according to some reports, told the Iraqi officials, and I quote, we in Iran know how to deal with protests. This happened in Iran, and we got it under control. But facts state a different reality. There is no Soleimani on the ground anymore. IRGC and the Quds Force are in retreat. They're not able to fund their proxy groups in the region and beyond the way they used to for 4 decades. In the region, and people and governments are forging new alliances against the regime. If you factor all these issues together, you can see how the regime's dream of regional hegemony, the point you alluded to, is withering away. And Professor Kazerounian, well, in fact, is correct that the situation is ripe for a major transformation in Iran and in the entirety of the region.
Excellent point, Dr. Sadeghpour, and I really appreciate it. You taking a moment to really recount the work that Congress has done on the issue of Iran. I think it's something that we as Iranian American communities, particularly OIAC, we're very proud as an all-volunteer, non-partisan entity to be able to echo the voice of the Iranian people through the Congress and making sure that the US policy is guided by facts. So I really do appreciate you taking a minute and talk about that. And you're absolutely right. The region is very different and continues to change and transform. And the alliances against the regime, both at the public level and at the policy level at the region, does not speak in favor of this regime compared to 4 years ago. So I do want to take a point about what Professor Kazerounian brought up earlier on the situation inside Iran. I actually think all 3 of you raised a similar point that the leverage of change in Iran is in the hand of the Iranian people. But Professor Kazerounian, can you elaborate on that and talk to us about what are the key indicators that can help inform a comprehensive US policy?
Thank you. I think perhaps one of the most important and one of the most profound elements that has changed in the past 4 years is the socioeconomic dynamics, and as well as the political dynamics, and what is simmering under the surface, which can lead to what the regime calls a final blow. If you take a quick glance at the social, political, and economic indicators in Iran, you can see how this regime has failed the public. On one hand, 80% of the population lives below the line of poverty. Indeed, 50% of the Iran's population lives in absolute poverty. The economy is in a free fall. Iranian currency has lost its value. Essential food like produce, eggs, and bread is rationed. Stock market is volatile and has numerous crashes. Fuel prices are constantly on the rise. In fact, the November 2019 uprising was sparked by the fuel price hike. On the other hand, regime has escalated arrests, public torture, and even conducts public killings. But the regime is not able to calm or control the restless population. Protests strikes, daily chants against the regime officials are happening at local levels as well as national levels. One last point, if you look at the parliamentary election in the early 2020, Iranian people refused to take part in the sham elections and forced the regime to acknowledge the low turnout. It is impossible for the regime to recover from that in the upcoming presidential election in June of 2021, especially when the public sets the tone with their slogans like reformers, hardliners, the game is over. I would say the 2021 US policy on Iran should not bid on a losing horse like the regime, and instead it should side with the Iranian people.
Absolutely, and I would add, the issue of Khamenei's health, his succession, and the continued factional fighting within the regime. Essentially, the regime is kind of imploding from within, in addition to the social indicators and the political indicators you brought up.
Absolutely.
Excellent point. Thank you. Professor Parsa, let me turn to you and pick up on the point that Professor Kazerounian raised. Obviously, the regime is blaming US sanctions for its problems, and but I wonder, even if the sanctions were lifted, would things change for the people of Iran?
No, the lifting of sanctions will not solve this regime's problem. One thing we must remember is that the regime in Iran is under different type of sanctions by different administrations, both Republicans and Democrats. In fact, the first sanction imposed on the regime dates back to 1979. Even if some sanctions, which I hope not, some sanctions are lifted, the key question is, will the regime let go of its deeply rooted corruption and mismanagement that leads all the way up to the supreme leader? I think anyone if anyone has any doubt about how deceptive this regime is, all they need to do is to look at the protest and the slogans of the Iranian people. People poured into the streets during November 1979 and again in January 2020 and shouted, "The enemy is here." The regime lies and says it's the US.
November 2019, right?
Yes, yes. People are aware of that. This shows that people of Iran are not blaming sanctions. Instead, they know the real blame is with the mismanagement, corruption, and deeply rooted in this regime, the construction, the body of the regime. You have to remember the economic hardship did not start with the tightening of the sanction post JCPOA. There were already mounting protests and massive nationwide uprising in December 2017, which carried well into January 2018. And then there was other massive protests in the city of Kazeroun and even Tehran's Bazaar. All these people protests denounce the regime's corruption and even level, and they were before sanctions, so has nothing to do with sanctions. One slogan that stands out is, "The nation is destitute, the head guy, Khamenei, lives like a king."
I would agree with you, and I think the points that you raised, the real message comes from the protests and the slogans that we hear from inside Iran. Absolutely.
Exactly.
So I want to give Dr. Sadeghpour, as our time is closing for the panel, that let me give you the opportunity to close the discussion today. And we talked about the key elements of the US policy in 2021, the situation inside Iran and the regime's weaknesses. But to sum it up, what is the message of Iranians in 2021, very quickly?
Sure, thank you. I think the message is very simple. First, let me begin with, let me direct a message towards my colleagues, Iranian Americans in this country, who have a wealth of firsthand experience and knowledge on Iran and can add significantly to the political discourse on Iran in a positive manner. So I urge my colleagues across the country in 41 states, in fact, that we have direct activity and to be in touch with their local and national leaders and policymakers to advance the cause for human rights and democracy in Iran. For their part, the Iranian people have already made it clear. They have earned and reserved the right to establish a democratic, secular, and non-nuclear republic as the alternative to this regime. These facts speak for themselves. America should stand with the people of Iran in 2021 and support their legitimate and peaceful protests against the oppressive and corrupt regime of the Ayatollahs.
Excellent. Let me thank all of you as our time is up. But the key point that you all raised about the issues of human rights, terrorism, regional expansionism by the regime requires the 2021 US policy to include the following elements that you all raised. One is to recognize the voice of Iranian people and their desire for freedom and democracy. Two is to disabling Tehran's terror and hostage-taking diplomacy in 2021. Three is promoting and encouraging the path to justice and accountability on the ongoing crimes against humanity in Iran as called by Amnesty International and the UN experts. And number four is leveraging the regional dynamics to counter the regime's drive to regional terror and hegemony. So with that, I thank all of you.